I want to start by welcoming everyone. My name is Amy Kruppel. I'm the director of the UF Center for European Studies. The UF Center for European Studies is a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the EU, as well as a Title VI National Resource Center for Europe funded by the US federal government. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. For everyone's information, today's discussion will be recorded and will be available on the UF-CES website. We will have a question and answer session following the presentation, and participants can submit questions through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screens, and those questions will be monitored and we will assist them getting to the appropriate panelist. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today to discuss legislating sustainability, public policy, and the environment in the EU. Today's talk and the virtual series are supported by the EU's Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet program. This discussion is part of the UF Center, Jean Monnet Center of Excellence rescheduled, as so many things, Spring 2020 seminar and workshop on achieving sustainability in the EU beyond the 3 Rs, which explored EU sustainability practices from a range of perspectives and industries, including politics, economics, urban planning, agriculture, transportation, etc. As part of this program, there was an advanced seminar. That seminar was moved online, but it was decided to hold off on these talks and webinars until the fall semester. And so we're very excited to begin that process today. We will have a second talk in the series on Wednesday, September 23rd, discussing urban farming and food economies in the EU and Eastern Europe in particular, with Professor Diana Mincinte. And for more information on that, please check the CES website at ces.ufl.edu. Our panelists for today's talk are Andrew Jordan, Professor of Environmental Policy at the University of East Anglia, and István Szekely, Advisor for DG ECFIN at the European Commission. Professor Jordan studies the politics that emerge when attempts are made to govern climate change. In the past, he has taken on leadership roles in many national and EU-funded projects and produced work for a number of knowledge users, including the OECD, the UK Cabinet Office, the UK Environment Ministry, the European Commission, and even the Dutch Environment Ministry. Dr. Szekely, in addition to his role at the European Commission, is also an honorary professor at Corvinus University in Budapest. And during the 2019-2020 academic year, which is when we first tried to work with him, he served as an EU fellow at the University of Colorado. Previously, he was country director and research director in the European Commission. Moderating today's question and answer session is UF's own Dr. Agata Kowalewska, a lecturer at the Center for European Studies and faculty liaison for the Spring 2020 JMC seminar and workshop on achieving sustainability in the EU. I don't want to take up any more time except to again say welcome to all of you. And I'd like to just begin by handing the discussion over to Professor Jordan.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Amy, for your kind introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation to present. Yes, we have had this discussion for quite some time about the presentation, and actually it feels with COVID actually quite natural here to be sitting in my dining room talking to you in Florida and perhaps in other places around the world. So what you and Agata and your team asked us to do was to address 3 questions, and I don't know whether those questions are on a slide somewhere, but if not, I can just explain them again, because what I've done is essentially I've organized my comments under those 3 questions. So the first question you set us as almost as homework was 5 years after the historic Paris Agreement, does the EU's action still align with its rhetoric? So yes, I mean, EU environment and particularly climate policy have been very long in the making. The origins date back, I think, as far back as the late 1970s. And progressively over time, the EU's policy commitments have become more detailed and more ambitious, starting in the sort of mid-1990s with the connection to the now very well-known 2 degrees target, and then through in the 2010s to a commitment to meet a reduction of between 80 and 95% by 2050. And then, of course, at the end of last year, net zero, effectively no emissions by 2050. So there's been lots of policy, and I think there's also been lots of rhetoric too, going back as far as Barroso, who talks about, he riffed off Obama's winning slogan, yes, you can do as well as the EU is doing, through to the more recent comments by the new Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, of a climate neutral continent, the first climate neutral continent in the world. And I think this rhetoric and this development of policy has attracted a great deal of academic debate and discussion, drawing on a whole range of different disciplines, international relations, public policy, national and also subnational governance. So it's a very active area of policy making, and I think it's also a very active area of scholarship as well. I think, though, this time, and I'm talking about in the last year or so, the rhetoric seems different. It seems particularly ambitious. It's ambitious, I think, in two senses. I think, first of all, the references are now not just to decarbonisation, but essentially total decarbonisation, which I think for an organisation which started out life as a coal and steel community is really quite a radical departure. And the second thing is that rather than climate being a particular, somewhat discrete area of policy making in the EU, it's now, I think, being presented as almost the overriding objective of many areas of policy. And in fact, the idea now, which is now being progressed through, as you might be aware, this European Green Deal, is to reorientate and realign all the existing other policies under the idea or around the concept of net zero. So it does feel really different. And I think that's marked by some of the comments that the Commission President made about this being the EU's man on the moon moment. This is something that the EU is attempting to do, something that no other comparable institutional organisation in the world has ever set out to do. Now, I think there's also a great sense in which the policy challenge of dealing this will be extremely transformative, not just for policy, but for politics as well. So what's happened since the arrival of the new Commission? Well, there's been actually lots of new policy making, and I won't go through all of it in detail. You can see it all on the Commission's website or in the Brussels-based media. But I mean, just to give some examples, we have the climate law, which is in the process of being adopted and agreed upon. There is also a whole set of other packages that somehow relate to climate change, such as a new strategy on biodiversity, a new food strategy dubbed Food to Fork, and then in the future, a new strategy on chemicals, possibly a new policy which would set a tax or at least a levy on imported goods, the carbon budget adjustment mechanism, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, very much the high point was in July when the EU adopted a new budget, multi-annual financial framework, which included as part of that a commitment to spend around 30% of that money on climate-related activities. Now, have all the actions followed up the rhetoric? Well, I think that's the $64,000 question. And until now, I think the EU has been very good at setting emission reduction targets that have been achieved, certainly in the 1990s and certainly with the 2020 targets. The targets were set and achieved almost ahead of schedule. It was almost as if they were pegged to be in such a level to be almost self-implementing. Currently, the EU is off target as regards its current 2030 target, and certainly will have to do considerably more to achieve net zero by 2050. I think this really will amount to a policy challenge that is even bigger and more significant than dealing with COVID. it's about reorientating whole areas of the EU's activities. Okay, so the second question you asked us to answer was in relation to the climate law, this new piece of legislation that's currently going through the Brussels policymaking process. So how has the EU balanced the political negotiations on that law while still providing a robust plan to combat climate change? Well, just very quickly, what is the climate law? Well, the climate law is the piece of legislation that will legally enshrine the net zero by 2050 target. And it provides a whole set of mechanisms which, when agreed, will allow the Commission to monitor progress and, building on those progress reviews, set new targets for the EU, interim targets. The final target of 2050 is fixed in legislation. It will be interim targets to get to that 2050 target. Currently, the MPs are considering that. There will be a vote in September and hopefully an agreement by the end of the year. Also going through the policymaking process is what's termed an impact assessed plan. So that's a piece of analysis which seeks to inform the Commission's thinking on the interim targets to 2050. And at the moment, the Commission is proposing of somewhere around a 50 to 55% cut by 2030. I think the Parliament is going to push for something considerably higher than that, perhaps in the order of 60 to 65%. The big question is, where will those two institutions settle on, along with the Council, towards the end of the year? So how has the EU been able to balance all these different things and keep policy making moving forwards, particularly in the light of COVID? Well, I think it's used the tried and tested techniques of manufacturing agreement at EU level that have been adopted and developed over the last 30 or 40 years, making side payments, negotiating package deals, bringing things together in a way where bargains can be struck across different issue areas, using different instruments, new instruments, ones that involve less legislation and more peer-to-peer learning, with the Commission involved not as a legislator but as a sort of an auditor of progress. And then, of course, the EU will also develop procedures, rapid procedures that will allow the Parliament and the Commission to achieve agreement. So these sorts of things help to keep the policy process moving forwards. I think there's an aspect, though, that's often not really has not really secured the attention that it perhaps could do, and that is, when we think about policy making, particularly around climate change, the challenge is often thought about as being developing policy that's durable, that will stick, that will not be adapted at the first opportunity. It's policy that will stick and will give investors the confidence to invest. And arguably, setting a long-term target gives the policy durability that lots of other actors are looking for. But at the same time, the EU has also found ways to build in ways of building in flexibility. So rather than, that allows policy to be gradually updated as the science changes, as the systems and the economy change, as technological changes are made. So, for example, we can see that reflected in the way that targets are often pegged to a particular year, like 20% by 2020. So it provides a staging post through which policy can be looked at again and, where necessary, updated in a sort of logical and foreseeable kind of way. And over time, the EU has managed, through using different instruments, different targets, different forms of analysis, has actually arrived at what I would term a form of active durability. So policy is sufficiently long-term to give other actors the confidence to invest and prepare for decarbonisation, but at the same time, it's allowed the policy to change en route. And this idea of active durability has involved different elements. So it's involved the Commission partly working at the EU level, but also working at the international level. So striking deals at the international level, which it then brings back into the European Union to then encourage EU level actors to reconsider their policies. So to give an example, the new net zero target, once that's adopted, that will then trigger a whole process of revision and reform in all other policy areas to realign all those existing policies to the new target. If we think this idea of active durability is really not is really quite innovative, and it's something that's really not attracted the kind of attention of academics that it perhaps should have done. If you're interested, excuse the shameless plug, we have a book out just last week. It's called Durable by Design, and is by myself and my colleague Brendan Moore, and is published with Cambridge University Press. So just moving finally to the third question that Agata and her colleague set us. Has the need to respond to COVID impacted forward movement on climate change, and especially in relation to funding available at the EU and the member state level? Well, I mean, I think in the first few weeks and months of the COVID crisis, I think it's fair to say the Commission and the rest of the EU struggled mightily. It exposed existing tensions and frictions and disagreements between different member states in the north and the south and the east and the west. It compounded existing uncertainties around Brexit, for example, and particularly involved a lot of required policymakers to devote a lot of attention to something that they didn't really expect to have to deal with. I think before COVID struck, I think the EU was undergoing a massive sort of green surge, and that was reflected in the European parliamentary elections of 2019, very much informed by the activities of people like Greta Thunberg, and also mass demonstrations on the streets of many in many member state capitals. But of course, since COVID struck, if you think about the classic sort of Downsian issue attention cycle, the demands for business-friendly policies have begun to grow. The car industry was certainly not slow in pushing for existing policies to be enforced more slowly, and for new policies to development of new policies to be slowed down. And then, of course, at the international level, the next big meeting of the Conference of the Parties, COP26, which will be hosted by the UK government, was put back a year, and that, reduced the amount of pressure on EU policymakers to develop new policies. But I think, as is widely known, emissions also plunged as a result of the economic changes that arose out of COVID. Emissions plunged. My colleague Corinne Le Quéré, who works on the Global Carbon Project, documented this. Huge reductions. Also associated improvements in urban air quality as well, that were documented by the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen. But remember, though, that will not be sufficient to get the world to net zero. PBL, which is the Dutch assessment agency, has calculated that something around 6 to 10 2009 to 2012 recessions will be required every year to get the EU on a track towards 1.5 or 2 degrees. So there has to be a significantly different change. So policy is now moving forward. I think there are signs that the Commission has the capacity to keep things heading in the direction of net zero. I think it's significant that Jan Timmermans has been selected to a strong politician who seems to be environmentally committed, has been given the task of keeping things on track. The legislation that I mentioned before is moving through the policy process. I think things to watch over the next few weeks and months, certainly the level at which these medium-term goals are set, 50, 55 or 65%. This is going to be really significant. Secondly, something else to watch is the way that all of this new money that was put on the table to deal with COVID, how well that deals with environment/climate change issues, there has started already in the Brussels bubble a whole debate about essentially conditionality. I mean, how green or brown are these funds? I think something else to keep an eye on are the Brexit negotiations, to see the way in which these two essentially now green or climate change leaders interact with one another, and the dynamics that are triggered both within the EU as the UK leaves the EU, but also within the UK as well, as particularly as it now takes on the hosting of the next big meetings of the COP. And then, of course, the development of a whole new environmental action programme, the 8th Environmental Action Programme, which is due to be published at the end of this year. Big question there is whether it essentially will adopt the same targets that it adopted for 2030 that it did before, or whether it will now, as the European Environment Agency has been calling for, really begins to target the driving forces of unsustainability. Okay, so lots of policy activity, but I think, as I said right at the beginning, I think the big question is really how well geared up the EU is for dealing with net zero by 2050. I think it's important, really important, not to underestimate just how significantly different this is to the EU's current reduction target and medium-term reduction target. It will really require a significant reorientation of many areas of activity that until now have largely been seen as sacrosanct. Farming, for example, food production, transport, or which have only really been significantly changed at the margins. It will also require the EU to continue to think about not just mitigation, but also adaptation as well, to come forward with new adaptation policies as well, to prepare the EU for higher temperatures in the future. And it will also, and this is my final point, I think it will take the EU into areas, much more politically sensitive areas that perhaps it's not really gone into before. And I mentioned some of them already. Food, farming, transport, things that really directly affect the everyday lives of citizens. And I think the EU has got by, for good or ill, by developing a lot of policy without really directly involving or only indirectly involving citizens. And I think there's a really important sense in which perhaps politicians at all levels of governance, and particularly at the higher level of governance in the EU, have really not prepared publics and citizens and voters for the significant challenges that lie ahead in implementing something as far-reaching as net zero by 2050. So thank you for listening. I hope I answered all three questions, and I look forward to your questions during the Q&A.
Now we will ask Dr. Sheklik to answer the three questions, and then we'll take the comments from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Talking from Brussels. First of all, let me start with saying that I'm so glad to see Andrew being on the panel and having this intellectual component to our common thinking coming from the UK despite Brexit, and I very much hope that it will stay like this, despite the disagreement in some of the areas. And I also feel nostalgic because my alma mater is not that far from where he is today. The first slide, please. So, can you change the slide? Okay, thank you. So I'd like to address the first question. Does the EU walk the talk? And I would like to approach this issue in two different ways, or give the answers in two different ways. First, look into what happened historically, and second, what our ambitions are for the future and how credible they are. And Andrew already talked a lot about both, but let me give my take, and let me admit that I am actually a macroeconomist doing economic policy in general, and in fact, I was heavily involved in crisis management, and we first, agreed on this panel. There was no crisis as such. No one expected anything like that. And now here we are in the middle of the crisis, having to do, such a formative or transformative change as, decarbonizing a economy. So first, let's look into how CO2 emission in the world evolved. And this chart shows the solid black line is the world. And some of the big players are shown here, like the US, the EU, admittedly it's still EU 28 in this historical charts, China, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And what you see there is that the EU, the green line, was the first major area that started to first stabilize and then gradually bring down, and recently a little bit faster, bring down the total emission, despite the economic area growing and becoming bigger as an economy. The US also had a kind of defining moment that was actually another crisis. For younger people to remind them, the 73 and then the 79-80 oil crisis, which was a huge shock to the relative price of oil, and not surprisingly had a strong impact on CO2 emission. In Europe, that lasted much longer. In the US, in fact, it was only the second oil crisis that a little bit moderated the trend. Nevertheless, the rest of the world went on, and in this chart you don't see, but it was actually the Soviet bloc, the Soviet Union and the countries around in the Warsaw Pact Soviet Union, which was at that time actually a very big CO2 emitter and in a way enemy number one for the environment. But since then, this became a much smaller player. Okay, now so we can turn to the second chart. I mean, in this chart, we see that China at some point, became the biggest driver of emission. And recently, actually, India is also catching up. Sub-Saharan Africa doesn't seem so like a big thing, but I will come to this point. That will be the next battleground. Next chart, please. If you look into a very basic kind of breakdown of how CO2 emission can be looked at, then we can say we are, the population is bigger, the economic activity per head is bigger, we are getting richer, and which is a good thing. That's why all economies work, and the emission per unit of economic activity is actually declining now for long, much less recently than in the past, but still declining. But the problem is that we are richer, which is good, and more of us, which is also in a way good for those who decide to have a family or bigger family. But the point here is that we cannot stop population growth for a long while. Still, it's built in and it's going on. We don't want people to be poorer. In fact, we want India to follow China and raise the middle class to a higher level, and bring them out of poverty. And certainly we want Africa a large part of Africa to get out of poverty. Next chart, please. So, and very quickly, just to remind everyone that what is the source of CO2 emission, because this will have major implications on some of the policies and some of the implications. Number one is electricity and heat. Number two is industry. So, in fact, during China's kind of rise as a powerhouse in manufacturing, increased rapidly. Before that, it was kind of declining. And then transportation, because we have to move around and we have to shift around people. And the rest is not so important. And in fact, electricity and heat is as big as the two other major items combined. And that, I think, will have a lot of implications where and what we want to do and in what instrument. Next chart, please. And then a little bit talk about the implications or the consequences and the relationship between how much you contribute to the problem and how much of the consequences you have. Because if you contribute a lot and you have a little bit of the consequences, incentives are such that you will be less inclined to take radical actions, and those who suffer more and contribute less will urge those who are on the other side of the spectrum or the other end of the spectrum to do more. So that will change the dynamics. Also, it will change a little bit the public support. So it is a terrible thing to see, Venice underwater, and you can see how deep the water was because people are standing actually in a square there. But on the other hand, it actually tells to the public in Europe that you are not immune to this. Europe is actually not a number one sufferer of the consequences, but now we have increasingly, and this winter, this huge storm in the Mediterranean, which had a devastating impact on some of the coastal cities. I think it kind of builds up the necessary public support and gives a bit of incentive compatibility to that part of the world where you can do more. The rest, next please. So if we take the first part of the things, is Europe, walking the talk? Next slide, please. Then we can give two answers. One is yes, and the other is but probably not really. Yes, in the sense of, you have seen in the previous chart that Europe was the first region to limit and reduce CO2 emission. And in fact, it's still on any, whatever indicator we use, it is among the leading, if not the best region in terms of way better than the US in terms of, total emission, trend in total emission per capita, per unit of GDP, or whatever. Another very important element of where Europe delivered, and it's much less known to many, is that in fact it brought in and helped a region, Central and Eastern Europe, and many of them are now in the EU, some of them are kind of candidates for EU membership. That was a massive CO2 emitter and diverse type, so to say, because of their industrial structure and military industry and all this. They managed to help them out, restructure, get rid of their legacy, and then reindustrialize and become the fastest converging region in the world without actually turning around this trend. In fact, continuing the red line in this is Central Eastern Europe, and this is CO2 emission per unit of economic activity. And you see that the dotted line, pink one is the countries at the similar income level in the world. And what we see there is that countries at similar income level, countries which also actually started to converge to higher income countries in a very decent manner, the trend is fundamentally different. Central and Eastern Europe reindustrialized, started to catch up, and at the same time reduce their per unit of GDP CO2 emission to the level where actually the other dotted line is the high income countries in the world as a group. So it achieved actually a result which is way better than what its income level would suggest. And the green line is there, the EU, which shows that the EU moved as a whole, sorry, it's EU 15, so without this region, moved together with the other developed countries, but of course a significantly lower level. So this is important because this is exactly what we want to do in the rest of the world countries, to continue their convergence, but in an environmentally friendly way. Of course, these are nice trends. This was not enough to change the world, but this is an experience. This is a way, how it can be done. So it is actually, I would say, a good way of learning. And I think it's an important manifestation of what the EU can do for countries that are catching up in lower level income. Next slide, please. So one answer is to say, yes, the EU demonstrated a strong capacity to walk the talk, but actually, did this matter? And we saw that historically, actually, it did not stop anything in the world. And if we look into, the new ambitions, so if you take the 2/3 reduction in the EU, which will actually, the 50 to 55% reduction by 2030 in the emission, that would actually shave off 0.2 percentage point of the world growth, which is roughly the latest number I could get was 2.5%. So the world is not different because of 2.5 versus 2.3% increase in the CO2 emission when we want to have actually a rapid decline. So it didn't matter. If the US had the same ambitious target as Europe, that would shave off, of course, much more. It would shave off 0.8 percentage point, but still we would be left with 1.5% growth, which is still too much. I think this tells us one important thing, and that's very obviously actually acknowledged in the new European climate law, that it is a global problem. We can make our own contribution, and we should be, because we should, walk or talk. We should, demonstrate. We should, show, lead by example. But we need the rest of the world to follow us in order to change things, and that's where the EU sees an important role. Next slide, please. So let's then come to the solutions or the actions we can take. And Andrew already mentioned this. I will elaborate on some of the points he mentioned. What is with the European Council now is the proposal for a European climate law. Now, I'm an economist and I'm a law-abiding citizen, so I take law very, very seriously. But at the same time, I'm an economist, and I look at law as a commitment device. Laws are endogenous. The way laws are passed and put into force, they can be changed or reversed or annulled. And even more importantly, actually we see sometimes situations where the law is unchanged, but the behavior changes a lot. Private behavior, public behavior, corporate behavior. So there can be a behavior reversal with the same legal framework. So law is very important, and law is a commitment device, and it's also for economists, for us, is a very useful kind of commitment device. But we have to be very careful, because they only work until the point that the kind of social consensus, the political consensus behind them is intact. The moment that is lost, there is a problem. And I think the picture in the background very clearly shows what that young gentleman thinks about a law, which actually, this is the famous Yellow Vest movement in France, which incidentally started with a carbon pricing measure, very sensible, strongly supported by the academic community, and the regulatory supported measure, namely a speed limit change, which is also thought to be a very effective way of reducing CO2 emission by cars. And here's the reaction. So we have to be very careful, at what point, to what extent we push things, and how that is perceived by society, and how we kind of deal with this. And Andrew already mentioned this buying out as a EU phenomenon. Buying out is actually very much a national phenomenon as well. And in fact, the literature on reforms very much suggests that we buy out losers. But buying out money is important, but it's not everything. You just need people to follow you. And you need every segment of the society following you. And we know that the contribution to the problem is very different across countries, different across different groups in society, different locations in people, but also the consequences of the climate change and the consequences of policies to address or deal with climate change. And that consequences are very unequally distributed. So we need to keep social cohesion on the way to achieving these goals. And if we lose that, as the picture shows, the most beautiful avenue in Europe can be really an ugly scene. So what this law does is also mentions the other elements that the EU will change, including the 55% target and the, importantly, the carbon pricing system and the emission trading directives, and I will come to this point, the effort sharing, which, how you distribute the adjustment to reach the 50-55%, but land use and all other things. And there's a timetable to this, which so far is actually kept. The next slide, please. So this was actually, in a way, before the crisis hit and the COVID came. And here we are now in the middle of the biggest crisis ever in the history of the EU, but also, peacetime history, really unprecedented crisis. So yes, the EU at the beginning had a little bit of a rough time. Also, how, national interest versus EU interest and coordination might work in an area where actually the EU as such and the Commission has very little power or responsibility, direct responsibilities. We can only lead by coordination, convincing, and kind of, you know, helping people, countries to formulate their own policies. Now, despite of all this, actually the EU came up with a massive policy response to this crisis with a speed which is unseen even in countries where policy making is so much easier and less, you know, kind of back and forth between federal level and state levels, such as the US. And what happened is that the EU basically almost doubled, I mean, increased by another 750 billion euro, its 7-year budget, in order to deal with the consequences of the crisis. Some of this is a direct consequence and the direct impact. Some of it is actually to rebuild the growth potential, the capacity, the economic, you know, capacity of the area, and particularly countries that are really hard hit, such as Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal, actually countries which have large tourism industry. And what it does is that it has a large instrument, which is to support investment into the member states. And now what the EU did is that it actually said, yes, we will do this, but it will be actually along the same priorities as the original budget, which is still there and larger than this one, even though it includes, you know, some other elements, which is income distribution, such as agriculture. But more importantly, this money is actually conditional on presenting a national recovery and resilience plan, which will be monitored, screened, and checked by the European Commission. And then when it's approved by European Council, then the Commission will have the capacity to check the implementation of this. And the funds will be released to countries when the implementation is in line with the made commitments. So it's actually a very, very strong commitment device, and it's a very strong financial incentive to countries. And you think that financial incentives are only important for individuals and companies? No, it's equally important for politicians. And politicians mind money. Money that, you know, comes to their country, because that's how they can deliver to their voter base, their voters, and that's how they get reelected. So this instrument, besides the fact that it's an important amount, it actually injects elements that are massively, I mean, which are very important in order to deal with the problem, commitment device, and also, you know, dealing with the time inconsistency problem. The time inconsistency problem here is that it's so much easier to agree to a wonderful target, to write something into a communique or even a law, but when it comes to implementing it and facing the conflicting interests around this, and paying, so to say, the political price, well, then it's so much more difficult to implement. So you need an element which is a little bit outside of this and keeps you on track. And again, they work until, you know, you are broadly in line, your thinking and your intentions. If you want to break away, you know, you need very, very strong enforcement mechanisms to, you know, stop people breaking away from something that they really want to break away. The next chart, please. The other very important element of this, which I think should be appreciated, is that, you know, you have this extra 560, part of it is loans, so countries will repay it, part of it is actually grants, so you need to fund it, and you need to, you know, pay out this in the meantime, so the EU will go out and will borrow, and then you'll have to service that debt. So you need to get a funding for this. And what happened here is that not only this was agreed, but they agreed that they will give new own resources to the EU, which are basically taxes of some form that will be directly assigned and, you know, collected by the EU. And you need a, you know, EU level, you need new sources of investment, and you need actually new source of taxes because of, you know, environmental policy issues. And the two is now nicely connected. So the EU will actually, one tax is already agreed on, which is more of an environmental tax. But the big talk is what Andrew already mentioned, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is basically, it's not yet, there can be very many different forms of it. So it's not clear what exactly this will be, but will be in some way, a taxing on carbon emission, or the carbon emission content of what you consume or import into the EU. And this is important because, what we call the CO2 leakage or carbon leakage is very, very large when it comes to the EU and the US. So these countries consume more of high carbon emission content things than they produce. And China is the opposite. So it's very important not to give stronger incentive to leakage, which would mean, you locate a carbon intensive part of your production in a constituency, whether it's cheaper to emit carbon. So I think this is another very important thing, and this leads us to a very important part of the problem, especially for economists, carbon pricing. The next chart, please. So carbon pricing, is many economists think, is the #1 kind of way of doing. I mean, besides, of course, the EU budget, which is a direct financial transfer to people, this is, just the same, but in the opposite direction. You tax someone for emission. And carbon pricing is strongly supported by the profession, and it's exercised in many, many countries. This chart shows the total carbon emission in the world that is covered by carbon pricing schemes. And what you see there is that the first big chunk was the EU's ETS. This is where they, the emission trading system, where you have to have a permit to emit. And you either have that permit allocated to you, or otherwise you have to buy in the market. And if you can actually emit less than, than you thought, then you can sell. So this is a market where there's a price for the right to emit. And the first such big scheme was the European ETS, which is still about 5% of total global emission covered, which is still today almost 1/3 or a little bit less than 1/3, let's say 30% of the total in the world. And if you add up all the other European ways, which are partly emission trading system, partly direct taxes on carbon use, fuel taxes, or in some other form, so the carbon content is taxed, then you see that something like 1/6 of the total world emission is under the scheme. And if next year China really, the Chinese ETS, national ETS kicks in, then it goes to something between 20 and 25%. So still a small part of the world, but the EU again showing the way it is. Now, next slide, please. If we look into the carbon pricing schemes, then again, one thing is to have carbon pricing. The second is, does this matter? Now, the way we can do this is the chart shows all the different carbon pricing schemes in the world. Some of them are taxes, some of them are these traded permission rights. And you see how big they are. I mean, the constituency where they cover the emission, and what is the price, the vertical, it says, so higher you are, the higher the taxing of 1 ton of CO2 emission is. And here, if you enter two things, what is the estimate shows that achieving the Paris Agreement would need in terms of carbon taxation level, or what the IMF recently suggested as a global carbon tax, which was $75 per tons. Then we see that actually very, very few schemes are above or within this range. And in fact, half of the schemes are at level below 10. And remember, the lowest, the estimate for the Paris Agreement shows is 40. Some people say the lowest is 75. So we are way away, far away from what this would need, including actually the EU, which is the ETS, which is the big green dot in the middle. The next slide, please. If you look into the history of all this, then we see that the EU actually ETS is the most expensive one. So the right to emit is the most costly in the EU. Anything that comes close to is some of the Canadian local territorial, I mean, this regional schemes. But even that is very recent. Until 2018, the European scheme was below 10 euro, which is roughly the same as $10 per tons. So practically meaningless, which means too many permissions were there. So the value of buying a permission was, I mean, you could get it cheap, too much supply. Since then, policy changed, so the price went up. And Andrew was talking about, the impact of COVID. We see that, there's a drop because obviously you don't need to emit that much during a crisis. But it is staying at around 30, which is actually much better than 10, but it's still not at even 40, which is the lowest limit, not to mention the IMF's recommendation 75. So yes, again, looking forward, the EU has a good scheme here in this area too, was in a way leading, but it's still not enough, even for the EU, let alone, for the rest of the world to change things. Next one, please. I would like to talk a little bit about one element that is much less frequently mentioned, and this is the role of cities in this whole process. Urbanization was part of the problem up until today, and certainly in large parts of the world, particularly China, which went through a rapid industrialization. Which now, cities are the places where productivity is the highest. Cities are the places where people, innovation, most of the innovation in the world takes place. But cities are also places where you have a lot of congestion, a lot of environmental damage made, and a lot of CO2 emission so far. So this needs to be changed. But the good thing about cities is that they do have the human capacity, the intellectual capacity, the research capacity, the knowledge to change things. They're actually the very centers of innovation. They also have actually people who want it, not because of the CO2 so much, but because of the other kind of side effects of emitting CO2, namely environmental consequences, air quality, traffic jams. So there are other local implications of this, that people want to get rid of this. So there's what they call incentive compatibility. People want it. And also they have leaders who can kind of, bet on this as their political future. And also they can bet the future of their city on making it environmentally friendly. I spent my time, last year in Boulder. Boulder is a prime example of offering high quality of life for people. So young, highly educated people are flocking to the city, which then makes, everyone, Google, Microsoft, you name them, come to town. So it kind of creates a new agglomeration dynamics along high quality of life values. And this is what, can change. So, and another beautiful thing about this, things which actually the C40 cities, that is a kind of global initiative showing the way on this, is that it's bottom up, and it is kind of a very nice way of learning from each other experience. And learning is very important here, is because we don't know the answers. No one knows the answers. So whoever is better in something, we need to quickly learn from that and put our energy into not reinventing what others do, but better inventing new things. So very quickly, winding up of what I want to say is that Andrew already referred to Greta Thunberg. And just a few months ago, we heard her saying, the house is still on fire. What you have done so far is nothing but empty words. There was no qualification there that Europe is different or anything. That was a message from the next generation to the leaders that you are not, you are failing us. Now, even for those people who think that the EU did not do enough, or much more needs to be done, and we have a very strong force now in European Parliament and in some of the member states, in government, and in now very important positions. Even if that is the view you hold, look around in the world where you can get inspiration. Where is the leadership which puts its political capital, it bets its political future on saying, yes, we will actually move into this direction, and we will move with this kind of ambition, which, as Andrew described, is kind of unprecedented. And much more than that, look what the EU does. It actually coordinates countries. It actually has what they call just transition fund, which helps those for whom the cost is much bigger and the capacity to pay for the transition is much less. So it's one group of countries helping other groups of countries with this transition. And this is the EU which has a monitoring mechanism. This is the EU which has a learning mechanism behind this. Not perfect, very far from perfect. And we all agree, and in fact, the European draft environmental law or climate law explicitly says that it was not enough, it has not been enough. I think this is what you can learn from, and if you need a good partner, a good alliance, someone to be alliance with, to achieve your goals, I think this might be your best bet. And I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we have time for a few questions, and there are two sets of questions, two groups. One of them refers to Brexit, the other is more global and relates to also to issues between EU and US and different approaches to the global politics, and particularly in US to the approach to environment and climate change as of right now. So let me start maybe with the Brexit question, which may be approaching. And how would the Brexit affect not only the policy changes, but also will change the goals and the achievement of the goals if the UK eventually leaves the European Union? So is Brexit going to affect the goals of European Union for the CO2 emissions or not? And how? And how it may
I think this discussion has two directions. Will this change things in the UK? Will this change things in the EU? I can take up the EU if you wish me.
Whichever one of you would like to start on Brexit and EU.
You go, Istvan. I'll follow.
Oh, okay. I think for the EU, this will not change anything. If you have anything, this will actually, give us strong incentive to show that yes, Brexit is not the best thing that happened to the EU. In fact, it's not a good thing that happened to the EU. But despite, we can be, a kind of, inspiration for the rest of the world, and we can show, in a way, be a leader in the international arena. What we lose is the UK, which was actually among the best performers in terms of decarbonizing. People don't realize, but the speed with which, particularly the use of coal in energy generation was going on, and then other kind of elements was just exemplary. So the UK actually, for the UK to meet the new 2030 targets is so much easier, would be, or so much easier than for the rest. And also, I think the UK was a very important center for the intellectual part, and also keeping us a little bit, more market-friendly in our thinking, and focusing on investors' kind of intentions. And what Andrew described, that what economic policy does is to kind of, create an environment where people can plan and act and invest. And the UK was, a very important part here is to do it in a way which is very market-friendly and not over-regulation. Because one trap or one temptation you have here is to go say, no, I need a strong state here and I will regulate. But regulation can be very costly, and regulation takes away private initiative. It can actually change asset prices, relative asset prices, in a way that destroys, investors' value. So one has to be very, very careful. And in this regard, the UK was always a very important component. We will move on and we will try to do this. And the Dutch are already, filling the void that was left there. and the Austrians and the others, quite rightly, because they're the net contributors, and also very, very competitive economies. But I think for us, this will be, you know, we move on. I leave it to Andrew to see.
Okay. Well, just first of all, well, thank you, Richard, for the question. Well, first of all, the UK has already left the EU. It left at the end of January. What is still to be decided is the future trading relationship between the UK and the EU, and that is due to be completed by the end of this year. So had your question related to environmental policy more generally, I think the answer might have been slightly different. I think there, at least the current Conservative government, or parts of the current Conservative government, are quite keen to in detaching from the EU to use it as an opportunity to reduce domestic standards in all sorts of different areas: water quality, environmental impact assessment, nature protection, particularly in the period after COVID, and use these weaker protections to sort of turbocharge the economic recovery. I think, though, that in relation to climate change, and here I build on what Istvan has said, it's slightly different, because there the positions have been somewhat reversed. The UK has been rather in the lead of amongst the 28 or now 27 member states. So I think that in future the EU will be able to achieve, I think, fairly quickly the technical challenge of working out its emissions for 27 as opposed to 28, and communicating that to the UN, or the UNFCCC, the framework convention which deals with climate change. I think what's still not clear in my mind and I'm thinking in particular at the EU level, is how the dynamics, the political dynamics within the EU, without the UK being in there, banging the table for market-friendly, pro-decarbonisation policies, how that will now play out. And not just mitigation as well. The UK was also, I think, very keen on pushing for adaptation measures, the development of adaptation measures within the EU, and other measures which help to green some of these other policy areas, particularly farming. Of course, finally, it's important to think about what is happening in the UK around climate change. And there, it might be useful for the EU to perhaps learn lessons from the UK as it moves forward. So the UK was one of the first member states to legislate for net zero. It has an independent body, the Climate Change Committee, that oversees the setting of targets over certain periods of time and reports on progress being made. And this is actually quite similar to what's now being proposed under the EU's climate law. Now, what's happened though since the target was the net zero target was set in legislation, UK legislation, is there have been all sorts of debates about actually whether the policy behind that will be able to deliver net zero. There's a feeling at the moment that sectoral policies are not changing rapidly enough and being revised rapidly enough to deal with the need to decarbonise over a relatively short period of time. There doesn't seem to be strong central coordination. The Prime Minister, for example, there was a feeling that the Prime Minister should be more directly involved in steering this whole policy effort, either him directly or his cabinet office. And then thirdly, again, and it's something going back to, I revert to in my initial comments, there's a feeling that the government hasn't leveled with the public and really explained what net zero will really mean for people's everyday lives. And we've had a big process within the UK, created not by the government but by Parliament. There's a Citizens' Assembly, which has tried to achieve greater public buy-in for the idea of net zero. And there's still big question marks around whether the government will accept the recommendations that the Citizens' Assembly will make. I think they'll launch tomorrow, actually, published tomorrow. And whether they will, and so these are the things that the public themselves have been able to debate, and policy ideas that the public itself will have been able to develop. And it's still very unclear whether, having said that they want to commit to politicians, are actually now willing to trust the public to come up with the ideas and the policy ideas and the policy support to actually implement net zero.
Thank you very much. So I hope that that question was answered to the satisfaction of our listeners. The other questions, there are two questions that relate more into more individual behaviors or behaviors of the small entities. So one of our listeners asked questions in relation to the US government not being really keen on preserving CO2 emission goals, or having general climate change not very high on the administration agenda. But there are cities and private investors who are very much interested in it. So what will be the good way for EU states, EU partners engage with the United States partners who are not necessarily government?
I think it's a very good point. It's an excellent point. And I also made this point when I talked about the smart cities things. And the C40 is actually very much of such a mechanism, because there are European, American, and cities from all over. The problem with the C40 is that when I made the comment in Denver at the forum that maybe Denver should be, there should be somewhere in the middle of the US among the C40 cities, they said, well, we try to apply, but they cannot get bigger than this, and there is a long queue of cities that want to join. So here's the time to create a diversity and have another form of maybe medium-sized, small-sized cities to, get together, learn, arrange themselves along certain lines. But the idea of, subnational, local, bottom-up to interact is enormously important. It's number one important because of learning. Because I cannot agree more with some of the questions or what is said there, is that what you need is citizens wanting to change their behavior, companies accepting that they have to change their behavior, partly because their clients want them to change. So you as a citizen can have enormous impact on business, telling them, I'm not buying your product unless you do things this way or that way. And then in the US, it works fantastically. You see such a strong impact. You can also have the same impact as a citizen through shareholding. You can be a small shareholder, go to any large meeting and embarrass their management there. And believe me, they will react because, they have reputation at stake, and it is. So citizens can do a lot, and if citizens can get together from all over the world, like-minded citizens who, share certain goals and learn from each other, coordinate each other, deliver, amplify the message, that is fantastic, and we need that much more than before. And also US states, because some of the US states, California is very different from some of the others. Colorado is now changing tremendously from its past, partly in thinking, but also in reality, how they generate energy and all these things. So yes, absolutely. And I think what the EU can do is to give some money, some support to these organizations, as we do in many, many other areas.
So
Dr. Jordan, would you like to add something?
Yes, would you like me just to speak directly to the question that was flagged by Christine about the relationship between citizens and
Sure, that
the
will
EU?
be very good.
Yeah, I think this goes very much to the heart of the issue. So I think until now, the EU has been able to achieve a lot of policy reductions, often, as the questioner was suggesting, without actually engaging with much policymaking. A lot of the emission reductions that have been made in the past, as Istvan pointed out, have actually arisen out of structural changes in the economy, changes in production and consumption, without many citizens even noticing. The ETS, for example, the emissions trading system, this really important, almost keystone policy tool within the EU, is essentially only targeting emissions from very large stationary emitters. Net zero requires something fundamentally different to that. It requires emissions reductions in our houses, in our diets, in the way that we move around, the way that we heat and cool our homes. Now, these things will require, I think, politicians to set targets, but also set targets and deliver policies that constantly are supported by the public. And at the moment, we sort of have we have a democracy problem, even in the EU, where there are democracy problems all over the world, but even in the EU, we have a problem. Often the EU is perceived to be remote, and, separate and not in touch with people. And for a long time, that hasn't really mattered, at least in terms of climate policy making, because the policy targets have been achieved. But moving forward, I think this is going to be more and more of a problem, particularly as the emission reductions, if they occur, really begin to bite in areas of activity that really will affect citizens. And I think a lot of evidence has been collected on what citizens feel, and very often citizens are willing to do a lot, but they actually look to politicians to lead. But the problem is that politicians don't like to lead too far or go too far beyond public views and voter expectations, because otherwise they lose their seat. So somehow there has to be a reconciliation and greater trust between publics and politicians around not just the ends to be achieved, but the policy means for achieving those ends. And that raises fundamental questions about the state of our democracies, trust in policy making, and so on and so forth.
Thank you very much. So if one of you could quickly maybe respond to the last question that relates to the current situation and COVID-19, how COVID-19 will affect the UN or EU ambitions for international negotiations in relation to emissions and climate change policy.
Sure. Maybe I pick up this question and start off where Andrew, made the comment that, it's very important that, we set the path, it's credible, so we stick to it, but at the same time, we are flexible and watch out how people react, because we cannot lose them. We have to, have their support all the way through. And maybe we have a noble target, maybe they even agree with us on the target, but they may have a problem with some of the ways or details of that. And if you don't react, then of course, we will have trouble. Now, in a COVID environment, this becomes an imperative, because some people are hit so hard. Some countries are hit so far. We are still grappling to understand the first wave of COVID in Europe and US. We don't really have yet a good understanding of what impact it will have on the developing world and the poor part, the real poor part of the world. So I think we have to be very, very careful with, in a way, how to say this, somehow guiding ourselves through this very, very difficult and fast changing environment where actually we don't even know what happened, not even in Europe and in the US, because there were so many government interventions in place that kind of blurred the picture. So we don't know how many people will lose their jobs. We don't know where they will be. We don't know how much, income loss they will have, and all these things which have enormous impact on their willingness to collaborate with you on anything. And then we'll, how to say this, push to the limit of your testing the cohesion of the EU or the cohesion of the US for that matter. So I think it's very important to internationally for the EU. Yes, we want to lead, but we don't want to be blind to what is happening, and we don't want to kind of lecture the rest of the world, which is much poorer than we are, which is has much less of a democratic mechanism. Our own democratic mechanisms are not good enough. Imagine countries where the system is much weaker. And don't talk about national politics. Think about local politics. Think about how a city runs and all these things, and how corruption interacts with all these things. So and their capacity to respond to such a huge shock, which is much, much less than in the developed world. So I think we have to be, first of all, we have to trust our political leaders that even if they don't push or they agree to some, you know, kind of change, postponement, adjustment, it is not changing their heart, changing their intentions. It is their judgment on how we can get through. Now, for this, you need trust. So, you know, we can only do this if, you know, the trust is maintained or rebuilt where it needs to be rebuilt. And that's a very, very a difficult issue. One idea we could do that, a trick, very expensive one, but a good trick, what we did, you know, with the Next Generation EU, throw a large amount of money there and say, yes, you can have this money, but only if you do this, 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 this as well. And this is an excellent opportunity to set up something for the rest of the world to deal with the COVID crisis and say, but it is aligned with our priorities. And do something very similar to that. Because then you put your money where your mouth is, and remember, you have incentives. You have something to lose if you don't deliver on your message. You have mechanisms to coordinate, to monitor. So kind of, you know, a commitment device that is so important in such a fragile situation. So maybe we could use this opportunity to break through another barrier, to put significantly more money into helping the rest of the world, but helping them in a way that also helps us with the environmental issues, and particularly the technological transfer part that is so essential and is so difficult for the rest of the world to produce, because to innovate, you need actually very robust societies, very good, you know, infrastructure, institutions, everything, which is a privilege of the developed world. So there's a huge opportunity here to, you know, use a helping hand at the same time, you know, progress with an idea. Having said all this, especially, you know, if this needs to be a significant amount, we need partners here. And obviously, you know, there's another big rich part of the world that could, you know, chip in. And generally, we need them back on this boat.
Yes, definitely. I have a feeling that discussion can last many, many hours. And, you know, judging by interest of people who are listening and your knowledge, unfortunately, everything has to come to the end. And Dr. Karpel will, I guess, finish our conversation and give some final remarks. Thank you for both of you for speaking to us, and hopefully see you in the future.
Thank you very much, Agata. I just wanted to take one last opportunity to thank the panelists, and of course, Agata, you are moderator as well as the participants. And to note that we would really appreciate it if everyone could follow the links that gets provided at the end of the webinar and complete a very short survey about today's events. And of course, if you're interested in the work that we do, to come and visit us at ces.ufl.edu. We have lots of activities on this subject or related subjects, as well as lots of other things on the European Union and the EU as a whole. I wish everyone a great day. I think this is a wonderful way to begin our day as we head out into lunch, or well, much later for some of you over in Europe. And thanks again. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.